Proportional Response. Book 1. Chapter 14, Part 1. Home Front. Episode title: The Path of Honor. Duke Kasler sat in the office room of his embassy apartment, going over various reports from Alincourt and generally enjoying a few minutes of quiet time alone. He loved his wives dearly, but occasionally he needed some space to decompress in, and reviewing the reports from his semi-not-for-profit holding company was just the sort of low-engagement thing to allow for that. He finished the last report and made a notation to follow up with the Arabso. They would probably find the micro-swimmer bots useful for their crops, and leaned back in his chair. He hit a couple more buttons to bring up one of his favorite comedians. The Themiacan woman had given a performance at one of the Venta Grand Halls recently, and he had wanted to get to the recording for a while. He'd barely gotten a dozen good laughs in when someone knocked on the door to his office. He ignored it. I don't get time to myself like this often, and if it isn't urgent enough for them to ping my comms... Another knock, this time a little more insistent, broke through his show. He shouted at the closed door. "Make an appointment. I'm busy." I don't like taking that attitude with people, and will probably have to pay for it later. But damn it, a man needs to relax on occasion. A hard, deep voice sounded from behind the door. A human voice, and only one human in the Venta embassy would keep knocking like that. "I will make an appointment if you like, but I am ready to talk." Blast! He allowed irritation to show in his voice. "About what?" The response came back softer than any words he'd ever heard from the man. "The second question you ever asked me." Kasler bounded from his chair and hit the manual door control before his mind even thought to use the voice commands. John Smith, his human bodyguard and accountant, stood on the other side of the door with a guarded look on his face, as if the man has any other expression. He backed up and motioned for the man to come in while hitting the "Gather Right Now" button on his comms unit. Kasler looked at the man with interest. John went over to the small bar and looked at him with one eyebrow raised in question, so he nodded back at the man, then held up 5 fingers, keeping his smallest one bent, to indicate a need to pour for his wives as well. John nodded, pulled out 5 glasses and uncorked a bottle of the blue wine. As the human finished pouring Euro, slipped into the room, grabbed a glass, nodded to John and took a seat. Kasler smiled and nodded when she turned a questioning face on him, and her eyes got wide for a moment, but she settled in to drink. His other 2 wives soon arrived, took their glasses, and had similar silent exchanges. Once they all had their seats, they turned to the human. John chose to remain standing and did something Kasler had never seen from him before. The man hesitated. He stood there, shifted on his feet, and stared into his glass. Golner finally grew impatient. "John, or whatever your name really is, my dear husband still refuses to tell us. You brought us here and pulled us away from things. I am intrigued to hear what you have to say, don't get me wrong." John seemed to shake himself at the words, but Kasler felt some surprise when he looked him, rather than his wife, dead in the eye. "The second question you asked me, after why I didn't kill you in our fight when I had the chance, I assume you remember it, based on your response." Kasler nodded. "I asked you your story. I was impressed that you chose to fade at that moment and settled for a moment of stalemate instead of a knife in my head. The question came out before I even thought about it, when you told me you hadn't killed me because you thought you could get away without doing so. That statement made no sense given everything I had learned about you, both from your reputation and the people who had formed your pirate crew." John nodded. "And you wanted to know why. Then you wanted to know why I wasn't willing to tell you. The answer to that third question is both simple and complex. The simple answer is, I have never told anyone, not even my closest mates. The more complex answer has to do with the fact that, all of my life, trust has been a thing that will get you killed, and that leads to the telling of my story. In my time with you, I have learned a lot of things, including and especially that honor is important, and the only way to truly fight the things I hated. I was, and still am, full of rage, and I fought the only way I could see to do so. The path I was on, however, would have, even on the slim chance I succeeded, turned me into just the sort of monster I despised. Hell, It had already done so to a point. You, he made a gesture that swept the room, have patiently, slowly, inexorably, and occasionally, with a severe backhand, shown me that, and what is needed to make the better world I wanted. You have also gained my trust. So, now I will answer your question. You see, I was born on HFY. The shadows from the window had grown long by the time John's story wound down. He sat, now, slightly slumped in his chair. Kasler sat in stunned silence, as did his wives. They'd taken turns refilling glasses every once in a while, and everyone seemed to have some. John looked up at him, and a single tear rolled down the man's cheek. The only emotion he'd seen from him, other than slight hints of deeply buried fury, for the entire tale, and the only time he'd ever seen an emotion, except guarded laughter or anger from the human. He looked into the man's eyes and saw something else he never thought he'd see. Vulnerability. He took another drink from his cup and gave the man a slow nod. I understand, and appreciate you being willing to tell me this tale. There is someone else who needs to hear it, who must hear it, and who, I believe, will be able to do something about that which you so clearly hate. Will you be willing to trust me enough to tell the tale again? John held his gaze for a long time, and he could see a war of far too many emotions for him to follow going on behind those eyes. At length, the vulnerability faded from the man's eyes as they hardened, like diamonds. The man gave him a single, slow, deliberate nod. Kasler turned to Golner, who stood and spoke. I'll call Henry and set it up. You know it won't be easy to get him to listen, Anne. Kasler nodded to her and made a motion like a sword strike. Her eyes grew a little large, then a sly smile came onto her face. So that is why you have been training him, she trailed off, then nodded. She knew what needed to be arranged. A cloudless, starry sky reigned over the massive courtyard of the human embassy as Enable emerged into the night to head towards the specially scheduled fighter practice. Such a bright, cheery evening. I wish Kasler hadn't decided to ruin it. Enable's right hand twitched as it tried to reach out for the hand of his girlfriend. I've become so accustomed to having her hand in mine, unless I'm on official business. Particularly when I am in this courtyard. Who would have thought she'd grow so strongly on me in just a few weeks? He put thoughts of his days, and nights, especially the nights, with Vashna out of his mind as he peered through the darkness and found only humans standing around the list field. The artificial lights of the courtyard had been turned off, and a number of torches had been lit instead. What is that daft Duke playing at? He walked abreast of the Duke, with some extra space between them. Kasler's wives fanned out behind them, with Vashna balancing out the 5 shape on his side, though he had no idea why Kasler insisted she be there. They walked somewhat slowly, and all wore their best flowing robes. None of the entourage wore armor, except John Smith, who walked between and slightly behind himself and the Duke. I know that Henry isn't going to be happy to see this particular human, but Kasler must have a reason. They stepped into the torchlight and a quiet murmur stirred through the humans. They had been lounging about or assembling their armor, waiting for the vendor to arrive before they started the fun. But each human who caught the whispered word suddenly stood ramrod straight and faced them. Enable had to swallow back his throat and lock his knees to see so many angry human face directed at him. No, not at him. At John. Mostly, though a few were directed towards Kasler. Henry stood in armor, speaking with Eldia, also already in armor, and his back turned to them. I am glad he finally saw sense that day. Of course, I am glad I did too. Eldia saw them over Henry's shoulder, and her eyes went wide. Henry spun around, his weapon appearing in his hand as if by magic, obviously ready to face a threat. He saw them, and his eyes went directly to John. He tucked his chin slightly and began to walk toward them with fury in his stride. Eldia reached out to grab his arm, but only found herself drug along. Everyone stopped moving, and Enable found himself rooted to the spot. For all that he is my bond brother, for all that I know he would never do me harm, watching an angry human advance is frightening. He looked over at the Duke, and found that the man seemed unperturbed. No, he is unperturbed. Respiration, chin, hands, he is at ease, ready for confrontation, but at ease. Enibal had never begrudged himself his cowardice before, but wanting to run from his bond brother, despite what he knew to be true, when the Duke did not, he didn't like that. Henry came to the edge of the list field, which put them about 15 paces apart, and spoke with angry tones. What are you playing at, Your Grace? This man is a pirate and a murderer. Among other things, he has no place on the field of honor. Kasler acknowledged Henry with a nod, and answered with a strong voice, but even tone. He comes to the field of honor to prove that he is, now, a better man and has learned honor. The Duke then turned to John and nodded. John stepped forward, his face a hard mask, and spoke with steel in his voice. You, who are gathered here, know much of what I was accused. Of most of it, I am guilty, that I will admit. The rest is not what I am here for tonight. What you do not know about me is why. I will admit that I have been a dishonorable man, but honor is not the nature of man. It is a thing that is learned and chosen. I tell you now, I was never given the choice, and never exposed to honor before I met this man. He raised his weapon to point to the Duke. He has taught me honor. Show me a better way. I have done wrong. I will not shrink from that, nor deny it, though some of it now brings me shame, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to balance the scales. At the same time, the start of my path was one of hard choice and necessity, and for that, I make no apologies. Now, however, I have a choice, and I choose the path of honor. John leveled his eyes at Henry with a challenging stare. Are you man enough to believe that I could be true in this choice, or do you believe that a man's failings define his soul for all time?